Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to LandO's Lock-ins, the series in which we do our darndest,
our best to make the most accurate CDL pick'em predictions possible. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you back to another edition of LandO's Lock-ins. That is right, featuring adeLLey, my daughter, just born a few days ago. It's great, obviously, to see the love that you guys showed on social media about her. That is the reason why we joined you last week from the closet. This time we are back in the office, so everything is good to go, ready to go. But I appreciate you guys. I was receiving a few tweets talking about whether or not I am going to be in New York for the tournament. It got a little close. We're pretty much like thinking, okay, probably not gonna be able to make it, but with the timing of it all, it is going to work out. So I will be in New York. I decided to record this before I leave. So there is that. At the same time, like I said, I'm going to be making it there just in the nick of time right before the tournament starts. So it's going to be a little close, but hey, it's all going to work out in the end. But I greatly appreciate everybody for the support on socials. I saw a few people on YouTube, even, going back into old videos and saying congratulations. So I greatly appreciate it. It's been kind of fun because I've totally like left COD for like the last few days. Obviously you guys didn't see me outside of, what was it, I think the last 2 days of week 3 of our major 4 qualifiers. I was not there, even though I was supposed to be, because all the stuff was going on. Baby was being born. So happy to be back. Like I said, my mind has basically, all the thoughts that I had are now coming back to me as I was writing what are 10 pages of notes for this video. As I said, for those that are, maybe this is your first time checking out the series, this is basically my prep for tournaments. I usually like to put some bullet points down, look at all the matchups, think of my, write down, essentially type out where teams sit right now, how they fare going into their matches, and then obviously with pick'ems coming along, I was like, hey, you know what, why don't I just talk about what my process is for deciding who I think wins these games, actually predict the winner rather than just talking about the storylines of all of these teams by themselves. So it has worked out to what you see before your very eyes right now. So the one thing that I do want to mention before we jump right into the bracket, right, is that it is going to be a very fun tournament, right? Because we are obviously interested to see who is going to be our major 4 champions, but we are most interested in finding out who is going to be in the top 8, more specifically, who is going to be in the top 4, right? Not who's making the champs, who isn't making it to champs, because the teams who are in the bottom 4, I'll tell you right now, somebody's getting dropped, somebody's getting traded, released, whatever it may be. The teams who are in the bottom 4, those rosters are not going to stick moving into the next game. There is no question, there is no doubt about it. There are players who are going to be in free agency. Maybe this is the last time that we see some of these players in the CDL. I mean, there's a very real possibility of that. So there's a lot of pressure, right, on all of these teams. More specifically, I would say 6 teams who are on the bubble right now to see who can make it forward. And there's a lot of situations, a lot of scenarios of which are going to be interesting to predict. Each game that we go through, I'm going to do my best to let you know if my predictions are indeed accurate, what that means. So I'm not just going to say, okay, London beats Toronto. I'm going to tell you London beats Toronto, this is what that means. Or New York versus Minnesota, Minnesota wins that. Okay, this is what happens. So it'll be kind of fun. We're basically entering into our own alternate universe, because the way that everything could go, I mean, if you get just one prediction wrong, everything changes, which is what makes COD so fun to watch and what makes this tournament so fun to watch. So I'm planning for upsets. I've said that previously, and historically it has worked out very well for me. Back, I think it was last year. I think I mentioned it around this time. And I said I'm going to plan for upsets. I'm going to go for some crazy stories, and everything worked out but one series. And that series was the finals. And I will not spoil anything, but if you do remember that episode a long time ago, it was like one of the first or second episodes we ever did. In that series, or in that episode, the 2 teams who I had in the finals could be matching up with who we have now. That was not intentional, but it very well could be possible. So I'm not trying to give away any spoilers, but that is something to look forward to. So, right, we're looking at the top 4, or rather the top 8, looking at the bottom 4. Also, all 3 of our major champions are in the elimination bracket to start this thing off. It is chaos. I mean, really, when you just look at this side of the bracket, really, when you look at the winner side of the bracket, it just feels like you're seeing avenues, you're seeing opportunities for teams to make it forward. But as we said, with teams who are on the bubble right now, it's going to be fun to watch, right? We've got New York, we've got Minnesota and Florida. 3 out of the 4 teams who are in the bottom 4 are starting off in winners round 1. I mean, what chaos this is going to be, without question, when it comes down to the bracket. So let us jump into our first matchup, London versus Toronto, the Battle of EU, as we'd like to call it. This is a rematch for Major 4 qualifiers. These teams have matched up a few times throughout the season, and I want to say that London are 2-0 versus Ultra when Gizmo is playing. I know there always is that crazy story, right, of Zero versus Bance. Historically, Zero's taken him down a majority of the time, and while Bance did take him down, it wasn't with London at full strength, so, there is that mix of it, but right now, London, they're the talk of the town, right? They're the number 1 seed. They finished 4-1 overall. They have made just such an impressive turnaround, right? They go from, probably at least a bottom 3 team in the league. Whenever they did have Harry in the lineup and we weren't for sure how Gizmo was going to play, you had to label them as a bottom 3 team. I would say right now they're at least around top 3 to top 4 range. So they go from bottom 3 to top 4, top 3 conversation, which is crazy. It's just a testament to how great those 4 players work together. The one thing about London that, again, because this record is great, don't get me wrong, the record is great, but I will say this structure, if you will, of the way that London plays, it does have its cracks and its crevices as well. It's not, the 4-1 record is very good, but there are definitely some issues with it that I want to point out, especially versus Toronto. The first thing that I want to point out with London is that we have seen this team on LAN before. Major 1, they finished top 3. Throughout the tournament, Zero was playing very well. We didn't really see Afro or Gizmo have that come out party that we were really looking forward to. Afro at that point was rated one of the better SMGs in the game. Gizmo was right up there with like one of the best flexes in the game. They didn't have that type of performance, even though they did manage to finish top 3, which is great. They go into Major 2. They ended up losing to Florida 3-0 in the first round. They beat Paris, that eventually get taken down by LAG 3-0. So again, you've had some success when it comes to LAN, but it's not been the players that it feels like are going to get you to the end. Now, again, it's difficult because with London, we haven't seen this team play on LAN in a very long time. So it's like, are those same things going to carry over? Because if so, their online performance, it feels like has carried over. So maybe their LAN performances will do that as well. Again, it's a weird situation with the Ravens to call exactly how they're going to play. The next thing that I will say with London that does worry me a tad bit is because their formula for success is known by everybody, right? It has worked well up to this point, but what happens when it doesn't, right? The series aside from LAG, what happens if they don't win both of the hard points, right? What happens if they lose a round 11 search destroy? That is where the cause for concern happens with London, because there is a guaranteed mode that they're not winning right now, which is control, right? They go 0 for 5. I think they've lost like around 8 or 9 of their last controls in general. So it's not just a Harry issue or a previous problem with the last team. It has been an ongoing issue for a majority of these players. They just can't seem to figure out control. And so, as I said, the primary success rate for London has been win game 1, barely win game 2 in a round 11, lose game 3, and then close out the game 4 hard point. It's how every series W has gone. The round 11 search destroy thing has been, I think, at least a thing in every one of their series, if not for one where it went to a round 10. So it's just been their success rate, and that is where things do start to get worrisome for London, because it's been such dramatic highs and such low lows, and it makes you wonder, again, what happens if they lose the opening hard point? Well, now they're relying on one round of search and destroy to go their way, a controller probably not, and then they've got that game 4 hard point coming up, which hopefully they do take. It's like it's such a scary ledge to be on, because it works out great for now, but we have seen teams previously see a lot of success in a certain mode by winning round 11s and start to fall off a little bit, right? New York at the Pro-Am, a very good example, still a very good team. Obviously, we're talking about New York here in a bit, but they went from winning basically every single search destroy at the Pro-Am in round 11 to then that basically being their biggest issue ever since, was because, hey, they probably thought, hey, we're good, we're winning round 11s. And then again, that is their biggest talking point, has been their lack of strength in search and destroy. And so it feels like while London is not good in control, they're 1, 2, 3 rounds away, 3 games away, in which one round is involved, where that record could be looking a lot different. And what happens if they get to a game 5? You're going to win back-to-back round 11. So, well, one game mode is solid, one is on the edge, and the third one is just not there. Despite what is a very impressive 4-1 record, again, it gets a little worrisome, I feel like, if you are London long-term, if a few of those things don't start to key out. So if the S&D gets better, everything starts to look better. I mean, if the control starts to see improvement, if they're at least winning 50% of their controls, this team is flying, right? And no pun intended. But let's talk about Toronto as well before we give our prediction for this series. I mean, they finished 2-3. What a crazy ride that the Ultra fans have been on throughout the Major 4 qualifiers. You know, they go into their own major with some high hopes. They managed to finish top 3. They go on a crazy losers bracket run. Started slow versus the Guerrillas in the very first matchup of Major 4. They go down 0-2, make a reverse sweep. Then they face off against London. They get beaten down by them 3-1. They go into the matchup versus Atlanta FaZe, lose that one 3-0. And then in their last 2 series, they finished 1-1 with back-to-back Game 5s versus Boston and a Game 5 versus OpTic Texas, in which they win that series versus OpTic in a reverse sweep. So both of Toronto's wins throughout Major 4 have come from reverse sweeps versus LAG and versus OpTic, and their other 3 losses are Game 5, Game 4, and just in general in the Game 3. So it's like it's really weird where Toronto sits, because I mean, we were talking so often about how it was the ARs. The ARs were the issue. They picked that up going into the Toronto Major. Now, in the early matchups that they had, a lot of it was on the SMGs. We talked about that a ton, right? I mean, we were discussing how it was the issue with CleanX and Bance. For the most part, I mean, statistically, at 0.7, 0.8 KDs, that cannot continue. And then even in that series versus London as well, the only thing that went Toronto's way was a Berlin control. And that is really the only game mode that has been consistent with this team moving in from Major 3 to Major 4. I mean, really the ultimate consistency for London, or for Toronto rather, has just been Berlin control. So it's like the fact that that is happening versus this London team was not great. Now, the one thing that I will mention about this series is that I feel like a lot of people are just going to go with this prediction, right? A 3-1 for London. You know what? They've looked great. They're the number 1 seed. No question about it. However, the one thing that I want people to focus on, again, because everyone just thinks about the control, no one's really talking about the search destroy, right? Not a whole lot of people are talking about the round 11 S&D, that going their way versus not going their way. The interesting thing is that Toronto is a roster who I think can absolutely beat London in a search and destroy. And if we're talking about London going to round 11 constantly, Toronto could be a team that beats them in those round 11s. On top of that, depending on the control, Toronto is also a team that can beat you in control. So if we're looking at it this perspective, I like Toronto probably more in the S&D. And then obviously London's not winning control right now. They lost their last 8. They haven't won a single one with Gizmo yet. That's 1-0. Now that's 2-0 for Toronto. And then for London, we're talking, okay, cool. They're going to win the hard points. You know, great. They've got that game 1 hard point. That's probably going to go their way. Maybe they do win a round 11 search and destroy if we're talking about it. The control's probably not there. Are they really going to win? Is that how they're going to walk away with this series? I mean, are both of those hard points guaranteed? I think that they look good to go their way. But this series, to me at least, has 2-3-5 written all over it. It does. It has 2-3-5 written all over it. I think they win the game 2 search destroy. I think you like them to win the control because that's basically guaranteed. Now they're going to win another search destroy, or if not, win a hard point off of London, which I think that Toronto is going to be playing better on LAN. I think for London, you know, considering how vetoes go, I'm interested to see if they can win both hard points in every single series on LAN. I don't think that's going to happen. So I'm going to go with Toronto here. I didn't just set this up for no reason. I do think that Toronto play them closer than many expect in the hard points because the SMGs are seeing a lot more success. I think Ultra can also win the S&Ds and also take the control. I feel like the Ravens formula, despite being the number 1 seed, it just worries me. It does. The fact the control is not consistently there, and the fact that the S&Ds are going to round 11 constantly, I think that, again, this is either 2-3-5. If not, Toronto can trade one of the hard points and take it that way. I feel like there is a good chance that Toronto could. I feel like the respawn, they're guaranteed to basically take a respawn. I like them more in the S&D, and that gets us to a game 5. And I trust Toronto, I think, more in those spots than I do London, depending on the way that you look at it. So, very first matchup, I think we go with an upset, and we have Toronto moving forward. So let us jump to our next one. So London, number 1 seed, instantly in elimination round 1. I will say it does kind of feel like that is the way that a New York major should start off. It feels like that's the way that a major should truly kick off, is with an upset. So the Battle of Europe goes Toronto's way. They move on. Huge series for Toronto. That arguably locks them up when it comes down to the top 8 because there are a few people who are concerned about them dropping, etc. So let's jump into LAT versus Atlanta FaZe. This is another rematch from the Major 4 qualifiers. We all remember the very Intense 5-game series in which, Thieves looked good everywhere except the search destroys, right? Back-to-back 6-0 losses versus Atlanta in the S&Ds. Octane as well dropped 0-6 double donuts in both the S&Ds as well. And I don't know, for Thieves, they were kind of in scary waters. There were some people who were even, debating on if Thieves could even make it into the winners bracket after the Florida Game 5 loss, but they did manage to pull out the win over New York. That gave them, instead of 2-3, they finished 3-2. Now, what's the most interesting part about LAT is not just the record, because like we said, they clutched out that series versus New York. That was very impressive, especially after losing to Florida. But what's most interesting is that the one mode that has been the guarantee for LA Thieves has changed up dramatically, right? The one and only savior of the game modes throughout the season for LAT, which was Hardpoint, no longer is. In fact, throughout Major 4 qualifiers, their one and only consistent mode throughout the season has gone from their best to their last. And normally that would be a cause for concern. But when you look at it, LAT goes 4-4 at Hardpoint. They go 5-3 in S&D, 2 of those losses being in the same series versus Atlanta, where they go 0-6. And then they go 4-1 in Control. So, I don't know. To be honest with you, I like this LA Thieves team more right now than I have in a very long time. Even though the Hardpoint isn't where it's supposed to be, even though, it feels like the double 6-0 losses versus Atlanta FaZe are the only thing that anybody thinks about right now with the Thieves. All those things considered, I feel like they have put themselves in a very good position moving into this major because they're not so one-dimensional anymore. Now, I will say that there is some caveats to that. It's not as if I'm like, okay, cool, LAT, they're guaranteed to move forward, versus Atlanta FaZe. I don't think that. However, I think that this LAT team, in comparison to the previous one, which was all about hardpoints, stands a very good chance of at least competing better or at least more consistently versus a majority of teams in the CDL. Now, the interesting thing about this series, right, is we talk about LAT versus FaZe historically, how many times they've been there, how many times they've had the opportunity to take them down. At Major 1, they were up 2-0 versus Atlanta FaZe. So we know that player for player, pound for pound, because these rosters have not changed throughout the year, they've got the chance to do it. And I feel like the extra layers that they're adding to their game in S&D and in Control could, absolutely help them get a higher seed, if not maintain their position in top 8, and maybe take a few teams down in the process. Now, we'll jump to Atlanta FaZe before we hop into talking about this matchup specifically. But for Atlanta FaZe, they finished 3-2. By no means a great qualifier from their perspective. They suffered losses to LAG as well as London. They managed in their last matchup to 3-0 Seattle. That was a great W for them, just to solidify things, just to get that kind of out of their minds and make sure they had that winner's bracket position. And similar to the Thieves, Atlanta FaZe has their focus has been, I don't know, for the last few months, strictly on S&D, right? Strictly in the search destroy game modes. I could list off some stats. I feel like every time that anybody who casts Atlanta FaZe brings these numbers up, which is great. But just their turnaround in S&D has been nothing short of stellar, right? It feels like that is still something that people talk about. Oh, Atlanta FaZe, they can't win S&Ds. That's not true anymore, right? It's not true. They finished, 4-1, 5-1 in S&Ds in Major 4. At Major 3, they look great. The only team that they really dropped S&Ds to in 5 series were to Seattle. They dropped 2 to Toronto. Still looked great. And then at Major 3 qualifiers, they finish 4-1 in S&D. So it's like you're talking about back-to-back qualifiers, including a major as well involved in that. So Major 3 qualifiers, Major 3, Major 4 qualifiers, where they have consistently been a top-tier S&D team. And it feels like nobody's really discussing that all that much about Atlanta. It has all been about, LAG beating them. It's all been about, just different players on the roster, starting to perform, et cetera, et cetera. It's been kind of that wave of motion for Atlanta lately. Again, not a great qualifier from their perspective. Still suffered some rough losses. The LAG one is obviously going to live on for a while. That was one of the crazier matchups that we've had this season. Dropping the series versus London, definitely you don't want to have that happen, considering that you could face off against them in winners round 2. But still, so I have a lot of thoughts on this matchup specifically. Just LAT versus Atlanta. You can make the case for Thieves, but as I said previously, they've never beaten Atlanta, but they've gotten extremely close. And as I said, with this Thieves team, I feel like this Thieves roster stands a better chance on paper than the previous iteration of this team, which was GVUTSU hardpoint winning, GVUTSU control winning. Who cares about the S&Ds? Let's try to clutch out controls and overall just be dominant in hardpoint. Now this LAT team has some depth to them, as we said, being way better in S&D, being 4-1 in control, and then obviously the hardpoints 4-4. At least they're even, you know. And then we talk about LAT as well. On LAN, they're a different beast, right? So they're finally winning S&Ds. They're looking great in control, and now they're on LAN. As I said, I feel like you can make a case for this Thieves roster to at least contest Atlanta FaZe a solid amount when Atlanta are dropping, you know, what, 40-30% of their series, at least as of late. Now, when I'll say this, while I absolutely feel like there has been some dramatic improvement from LAT, the thing that I do worry about the most in this matchup and moving forward for the Thieves is their hardpoint map pool. Because LAT are not going to touch Bocage. LAT are not going to touch that map for obvious reasons. I mean, we talk about this team being 3 ARs, you know, and a costume of wearing an SMG from time to time as Kenny. They're not going to touch Bocage. They've won just one Tuscan hardpoint since the Pro-Am. All of their other wins in hardpoint have come from either GVUTSU and Berlin. Atlanta has a choice to make because they've been playing Berlin a lot more recently. We know that they are a good GVUTSU team. They did lose a GVUTSU to Thieves in Major 4. However, well, they are playing Berlin a lot more, you know, it's kind of up in the air, right? If you are Atlanta, do you want to play them on GVUTSU, a map that you have a great record on historically, but one that Thieves thrive on? Or, right, do you want to ban out something like a Berlin where you don't have a ton of success on? LAT do like it, but you've started to practice it a little bit more. Maybe you prefer saying LAT on Berlin versus GVUTSU. So it feels like Atlanta has an interesting decision to make. It feels like they have the balls in their court, if you will, when it comes down to this series in regards to the vetoes. Because as we said, Bocage is not going to be there. We're definitely going to have a Tuscan, and it's a matter of whether or not we're going to have a Berlin or a GVUTSU. It's a very good chance we could see Atlanta just say, you know what, we're going to play them on GVUTSU. That's fine. But you could see Atlanta FaZe bow down a little bit and say, okay, we don't want to see the Thieves on LAN, on GVUTSU. Let's not give them that opening hard point that they are so desperately going to want. Now, I also feel like for Atlanta FaZe, I think, again, another problem for LAT, while the S&Ds have been better, as we said, back-to-back 6-0 losses versus Atlanta FaZe in our most recent qualifier, it happened. So there was no question about it. While LAT is looking better in S&D, 2 weeks later, is LAT really going to beat them in one S&D, let alone two? I don't see that happening. Again, for the conversation of the hardpoint map pool, while I feel like Thieves are getting better, and while I feel like they could really contest this Atlanta team, I just think that FaZe ultimately come out. They look better. I think this could go down to a game 5. However, I'm going to say it ends in a game 4. I don't know. It's just the way that I feel like this could definitely go to a game 5. If I could change it, I would maybe later down the line if I thought about it a little bit more. But I think that's where we're going to sit with it. Atlanta handle Thieves in just 4, and they move forward to face off against Toronto in winners round 2. Not a lot of people would have this in our first 2 matchups. We got to speed on forward here. So let's jump into our next one. NYSL versus Minnesota Subliners v Røkkr. The teams that can't seem to get a single W in major lands. So many people want to say that New York can't win on land, yet they win the Pro-Am. So this doesn't make any sense. But New York has not won a single matchup when it comes to major lands. Minnesota, I don't think they have hardly any, if maybe one at most on land in general. So this is the match to talk about when we are talking about the top 8, right? When we're discussing what this major is in, I should say, it's not that it's what it's really for, but what is definitely going to be highlighted the most in our first few days of coverage is going to be based off of 3 teams: New York, Minnesota, and Florida. Obviously, we're talking about New York and Minnesota. Probably look the 2 strongest, I would say. I mean, I guess the only debate would just be Minnesota versus Florida. Who do you think is maybe the second versus third? New York, obviously the best right now. Can they break in, right? Can they break into the top 8? Can they make it forward? It feels like whoever wins this match has a seriously good opportunity of making it to the winners final, because full respect to Boston and Florida. But if you are New York and if you're Minnesota, you would definitely rather play Boston than Atlanta or even London, right? I think it is fair to say the winners round 2 matchup, no matter who you are, this is definitely the best case scenario for either New York or for Minnesota, whoever wins this game. At the same time, if New York or Minnesota, whoever loses this, season could be over, right? The season absolutely could be over. It would be a much more dire situation for somebody like New York because of where they sit in the standings right now. Coming into this, Minnesota sit just under LAG in the 9th seed. So if Minnesota, for example, lose this series, there is still a chance they can get into the top 8 for sure. They're going to have to go on a loser's bracket run, hope that LAG struggle, hope that Florida struggle, etc. However, if New York drop this, it basically is a matter of, okay, they got to be perfect, right? I mean, literally, they have to not just make a run, but at least get to the finals, if not win the entire thing, considering you're allowing Minnesota to get points. You're praying that Florida doesn't get points. You're praying that LAG doesn't get points, etc. So this is a much more important game for New York than it is Minnesota, but only by like 5%. Like, if we're being honest, it's barely a more important game for the New York side. New York, though, has a very, very solid qualifier, right? They finished 4-1. Last series they lose to is versus the Thieves. Very, very impressive just in general what they were able to do. We talked about it. It was very likely they were going to finish 3-2. Very likely they could even finish 2-3 when you have OpTic, when you have Seattle, when you have LAT on your schedule. It was never going to be easy, but the fact that they finished 4-1, I know they would have liked to be 5-0 just to make this run a little bit easier for them. It is still on, right? The chase is still on, and it's going to be tough. I will say that it is going to be very tough for New York to be able to come away with this W. And I feel like the path to success starts with this, right? If we're talking about New York being where they are, depending on who they play, Boston or Florida, that definitely can be a W. It can also be a W for Minnesota. Florida beats Boston. That means that Florida's looking much better. If they're facing off against New York or Minnesota, that is definitely doable for them. So it feels like whoever wins this first round game, depending on who they face off against, it is almost a 50-50 in terms of who can get 20, if not 30 points added to their overall score line. So as I said, with New York, Hardpoint, we know the deal, right? It's still their bread and butter. They go 9-1 in Major 4. S&D finished 3-3. Only getting W's on Desert Siege right now, which is slightly concerning. I know they did drop a Desert Siege versus Thieves as well, so it's not as if, Desert Siege is something that they just can't be beat on. And then in Control, they finished 2-3. It's one of those, a similar story to London. I mean, arguably more severe, but maybe not as severe. In terms of, New York winning more hard points, if not the same amount of hard points as London. S&Ds are kind of up in the air. Control, at least they're winning more controls than London. So it's kind of a mixed bag right now when you talk about both these lineups. Now, I feel like for New York, and I feel like I say this every time I talk about the Subliners, what's going to define their run is whether or not they can win Search and Destroys, right? Control, expect them to take it. If they can be elite in hardpoint, be at least, good, if not great in Control, and then combine that with playing well in Search Destroy, they have absolutely the ability to make a run. I mean, combining their dominance in hardpoint, them being without question a top 2, top 3, I think at lowest hardpoint team in the game, combining that with the second good game mode and a third 50-50 game mode is the ultimate path to winning a championship. And so it feels like right now New York have a very good chance of I guess taking this matchup versus Minnesota, just because I don't know, like for Røkkr, they finished 2-3. They started off Major 4 well after some, big shortcomings at the Major 3 tournament. They started off the Major 3 qualifiers going 5-0. They enter into Major 3. They lose that opening series versus Thieves and never really get anything going. I don't know. It's like they come into Major 4. They suffer losses to Florida. They suffer a loss to London. They allow for Major Maniac to get his revenge versus them. They later beat Seattle and Paris in Game 5 situations. Had a very scary matchup versus Paris that they absolutely could have lost. But in these last two series, you have seen a bigger team effort, right? You've seen a more consistent lineup, but it just makes you wonder, like, is it just because they're playing against Seattle and Legion? Again, if these are matchups versus, two more top heavy teams, does Minnesota go, 1-4? Like, is there only W versus OpTic? Is that really going to be it? It makes you wonder, right? It makes you definitely wonder. And I will say, like I said, New York look like the better team right now. It just feels like the way that they take this series, if you're Minnesota, is by getting it to a Game 5. Like, that's been their path to success versus Paris. It was their path to success versus Seattle. Get it to a Game 5, rely on those S&Ds, and just hope that hardpoint and Control, pick itself up. Another positive for New York, is that if Minnesota aren't winning the S&Ds, you're winning this series in a 3-0. It feels like, because Minnesota go from 5-0 in Major 3 qualifiers in Hardpoint to 1-4, so their control is not looking nearly as good. Hardpoint is still iffy. S&D, a majority of the time, is going their way. So if you're New York and you're winning the Hardpoints as you're expected to, you're probably expected to win the controls. Then you're thinking about the Search Destroy, and it's like, hey, if you're winning the S&D, there is no way we lose this. So it just feels like the odds are really stacked up against Røkkr here in this series. I've seen a lot of people actually predict Minnesota or talk about how they could come out, perform on LAN. I think there was definitely the possibility to see that happen. But my biggest focal point for Minnesota is going to be on Priestahh and Standy. I think that we know what we're going to see from Attach. I think Havok, even though a lot of people don't think he's a LAN player, he played great at Major 3. He has been the guy who has gotten them through so many series. He did so versus Seattle especially. I think he's going to be just fine, if not solid. I think you're looking at Standy and you are looking at Priestahh to be the overall difference makers in their roles to try and contest this New York team. But as we talked about for the Subliners, they are going to be on home soil. They're going to have the crowd behind them without a doubt. And like I said, this series most likely decides one team who very well could be getting eliminated from champs. I mean, this could be the game, the series right here, where those champs runs start to end, which is unfortunate. Now, I have heard that Hydra also could have COVID right now, which is we obviously hope that everything's going good with him. This is contingent, obviously, on him being fine. And I know that I've talked, around. I'm sure a lot of people expect me to choose New York, but I'm gonna predict New York to take it in 3. I think that New York win the opening hardpoint. I think the S&D is never a guarantee for Røkkr. I'm expecting New York to play well, and I think if they're playing well, that means they're also playing well in S&D. And then because of the control struggles recently for Røkkr, I don't expect them to take that either. I think that New York gets some great momentum, get the crowd under them. They beat Røkkr, and again, a huge W for NYSL because, as we said, they are praying LAG, Minnesota, and Florida struggle. Doing so, getting Minnesota out of the picture early is great. And also, if we are talking about this, head-to-head matchups are very important, right? That is the way that you decide tiebreakers. So if New York and Minnesota, for example, both get erased from the tournament with the same series count versus each other, that's where things start to get dicey, and it could come down to just a percentage, a map, etc. So not just beating Minnesota is important, but beating them in a 3-0 is the best thing that you can possibly do, not just for confidence, not just for momentum, but from a percentage standpoint and from the head-to-head standpoint that could happen if these teams tie it up. So I think that New York get going, and then Minnesota will face off against OpTic Texas the following day in the elimination bracket, which is interesting. Very, very interesting stuff. So let's move on now to the final game of the winner side. It is Boston versus Florida. It feels like these teams match up almost in like every single major. They've matched up countless times. I would want to look at those stats. It's just difficult because of the recent team changes. It's not really going to matter a whole lot because Florida brings in 2 players. Boston brings in a player. And what is most interesting is that Florida's roster change involves a player who is now on Boston, that being Vivid. So Vivid is facing off against his former team. That should be a treat because there's been all kinds of memes talking about how Vivid is sleeping great at night, seeing that Florida is struggling. Florida's not seeing maybe as much success as they would have liked. And really for Boston, they're floating right now. They're feeling great. They finished 4-1. They've got the number 5 seed. They look to be in a great position. I mean, you win 1, maybe 2 series, and you are good to get into the top 8. I think that they come into this major without a ton of concern about that. It's just trying to improve. And honestly, just try to win some S&Ds because it feels like for Boston, they have absolutely turned their entire team around. Right? I would call Boston, like, the conversion is complete in terms of what they have changed their game plan up to, what they've been able to do. I would say that what impresses me the most about Boston is that, well, I wasn't a fan of the roster change on paper. They have absolutely embraced it. I mean, they have absolutely embraced this new identity that the roster now has because, they basically instantly recognize that this team is going to be totally different with Vivid in place of Capsule, right? This team is now faster than ever. They can't be relying on S&D anymore because Capsule is by far your best search and destroy player. And so if you were to tell me that Boston Breach, right, the franchise of Boston Breach with the roster change, they bring in Vivid, and you were to tell me that, hey, S&D, it's not good. In fact, they go 2-5 in search destroy. They're last in defensive win percentage. They're also last in first blood percentage. I would think that roster change went over horribly. But the positive for Boston is that while the S&D is by no means solid, the respawns are, right? The respawns are looking great. They go 10-4 in total respawns throughout the Major 4 qualifiers. I mean, it feels like Nero has reached new levels when it comes down to this team. They're without a doubt, I mean, one of the, if not the scariest team on Bocage at this moment. And while it did not feel like the greatest strategy call, if you will, if you're Boston, right, bringing in Vivid, we're talking about pace, you know, maybe can the ARs keep up with the SMGs? They've been able to do that. Can they win S&Ds? No, not really, but it doesn't matter when you're only winning the respawn. So it really has been a very impressive sequence of events from Boston Breach. As we said, just one of the better roster changes, one of the better additions that we've seen this season that a team has made. It's been controversial, but it's worked out absolutely in their favor. But again, we talk about different teams, whether it's London, whether it's a New York situation, whatever it may be. There is that one game mode that is really lacking right now for Breach that could hold them back. As we said, one that historically they've been phenomenal at. At one point, you could have called them the best, if not second best S&D team in the game. Don't have that mantra, but as we said, they have changed things up, and it's only been for their benefit. On the other side for Florida, as we said, they make a roster change coming into Major 4 qualifiers. They say goodbye to Vivid. They bring in 2Real. They bring in Major Maniac. They also say goodbye to Dave Patty as well. And it feels like for Florida, they have barely managed to land this plane. This plane of a roster change move. I mean, everybody was ready to have the pitchforks out, you know, for Florida to talk about how their early struggles, are a sign that this was not the right change to make. You know, they go into their very first series, drop it versus New York. They rebound, right? They take down Minnesota. Major Maniac gets his revenge. Then they lose versus London. They have a very scary series versus Paris in a game 5. And then, right, they managed to go into that series versus Thieves and they take it, which was great. I mean, it was impressive, the fact that they were able to take it, and they also take it winning every game mode, right? They win a hard point, they win a control, they win a search destroy, and that as well is what feels like has changed for Florida, because Florida goes from a hard point winning type of team, you know, not winning S&Ds at all because their map pool is not great in search destroy. And then it's like if they're winning controls, then cool, like they're going to win this in a 3-1 losing the S&D. That was the mantra for Florida. Now it's like they're no longer just opening a hard point winning team. They're now basically 50-50 in every single game mode. So it is interesting because it's like you look at the game mode perspectives, you know, point of it for every single team, and you're like, you know, if you could just get, you know, to the 60%, you know, win percentage category in every single game mode, you'd be great. I feel like Florida saw that was just not going to happen with the team. They made the move that they did, and it feels like, well, they have been getting better in the other modes. Hardpoint has taken a back seat. So it just makes you wonder what Florida we are going to see, a team that is going to be more unpredictable, I guess, moving forward. And as we talk about with search destroys, things of that nature, the respawns are going to be really fun to watch when it comes down to this matchup. With Florida, you know, one of the biggest talking points around this Mutineers team has been 2Real. You know, he still hasn't been great. He hasn't really been where you'd like him to be. I mean, overall, when it comes down to the rest of the roster, Awakening's been fine. Major Maniac has started to find his footing, especially in these last few series. It feels like 3 out of the last 4 series, he has been especially good, if not great for them. But to me, for Florida, Skies has to be the superstar, right? Skies has to be present if they expect to make a run. I feel like when you talk about this Florida team, you know, you have some great pieces. Awakening at times is amazing, right? The skill that he has is great. Major's always going to be, you know, a solid player without question. It feels like his intangibles are the most important part of his game. 2Real's just not it. So it's like if you're going to have Florida make a run, the guy who has to be that is Skies. You know, a prior MVP candidate, one of the better players that we have in the league, and at times takes over series. I mean, I would put him up there with one of the most, I guess from a gun skill perspective, one of the highest levels that we've got in the entirety of the game. To me, it feels like if Skies is playing especially well, he could be the catalyst that kind of brings everything together. It's the hard points, it's the S&Ds, it's the controls, it's the clutching up, it's taking out teams that are better than you on LAN. And that's where a lot of these points have come from Florida. The reason why they sit in the position that they do, you know, trying to get in the top 8, being in a great position to do so when it comes down to the major, it's because of these upsets on LAN, you know, versus teams like OpTic Texas, etc. You know, at Major 2, making runs at Major, you know, it feels like that is the way that they've got the job done. Now, when it comes down to this series, Boston versus Florida more specifically, A Florida win. Now we're talking about, standings, because this is, I said, is a very important game when it comes down to the standings. A Florida win instantly gives them plus 20 because of the way the bracket works. If you win a winners round 1 game, you get into winners round 2, that is plus 20 points guaranteed. So a Florida win gets them plus 20. That gets them to 160 points overall. If the rest of my predictions are accurate, that would move the Mutineers from the current 10th seed to the number 7 seed. And if one of my predictions is incorrect, Toronto loses to London, which a lot of people are going to have London beating Toronto. If this ends up going the opposite way, then Florida would not just be in the 7th seed, they would actually be tied with Toronto for the number 6 seed at 160 points. So Florida with a W jumps into the top 8. More specifically, they jump into the top 7. And if this series ends up going London's way, they tie Toronto with 160 points for top 6. So you just see the shift that this series would make for Florida. A big one for them. When we talk about the vetoes, in regards to this series, Florida are playing a ton of Tuscan. That has been their game 1 in basically every series so far through our Major 4 qualifiers. The negative for Florida is that's Boston's auto veto. On the other side for Boston, playing a lot of Bocage. As we said, one of the best teams right now in that game mode. That has been Florida's auto veto lately. So we're probably going to see a Berlin and maybe a Gavutu. We talk about controls. Probably going to see a Tuscan control between these two teams as well. I just look at this from a recent results perspective, and I just feel like Boston, while the S&D is shaky, I do like them to win the control. If it's on a Tuscan, to at least take one hard point, and then with the S&D being up in the air, I think that you could also give Breach that W as well. It's an interesting call. I think if you're looking at 2 players, it's going to be Nero versus Skies. Maybe you look at TJ more if we are going to have like a Gavutu and maybe a Berlin when it comes down to the hard points. But I do like Boston as of late. Again, Florida are one of those teams that can't upset you on LAN. It just feels like Breach and the mode that they are in, it feels like they're more composed. I like their chances of getting better at search and destroy than I like at Florida. Then I like Florida raising all of their game modes individually and getting to a level where they can beat a team like Boston. So I'm going to have Breach winning this in a 3-1 fashion. That is 20 points for Boston, guaranteed. As we said, they are good. Florida, not so great. If you are New York, you are happy as can be because Minnesota and Florida, you obviously have a hand in beating Røkkr, but more specifically, Florida loses their opening game. Those are the 2 out of the 3 teams above you who have already lost one matchup while you are instantly gaining 20 points on both of them. So we're already talking about the bottom 4, top 8 conversation, and New York just has a huge rise with Florida and Røkkr dropping in their opening winners bracket games. So let's go ahead and jump on down to the elimination side and really just start from here. As we said, London versus LAG, the next team, if you are Minnesota, Florida, more specifically New York, that you need to see drop this series, right? You need to see the Guerrillas lose this series versus London, who are off of a loss. As I said, it very well could be Toronto, who is going to be in this matchup. And what's interesting is that no matter who LAG plays, they did face off against both of those teams at the Major 4 qualifiers, right? They played Toronto and they played the London boys. When it came down to Toronto, they got reverse swept by them, but they did manage to reverse sweep London, which is very interesting. So LAG's got a lot of history when it comes to both these teams as of late. Guerrillas, they ultimately finished 2-3. Definitely were the cause of many incorrect pick'ems in the Major 4 qualifiers, right? They had a very tough schedule when you really do look at it for the Guerrillas. They have W's versus Atlanta. They have W's versus London, as we said a moment ago. They do suffer a loss versus Boston in a 3-1. And they get reverse swept by Toronto. So, they very well could have had a W versus Atlanta, versus London, and versus Toronto, which is crazy to think about. Those could have been the score lines for this LAG team. And I honestly, if they close that one out in a 3-1, I think that LAG are instantly looked upon in a different light. Not only are they in winners bracket, but they beat maybe number 1, number 2, number 3. When we talk about, Atlanta and London, where they sit in the pick'em, or rather where they sit in the power rankings right now. So I don't know. LAG, a lot of people I feel like have given up on them, but there's still some fight left. Like there is still some fight when we talk about this LAG team. Slasher most recently has been excellent. He puts up a 1.39 versus London last go around. Despite the loss versus Boston, everybody goes negative except for him. He still puts up a 1.09. And then versus Atlanta FaZe in their W over the Atlanta boys, they finished with a 1.42 overall. Right now, Slasher sits with the number 4 overall KD in the Major 4 qualifiers. That's behind, I think, like Dashy, Cellium, Pred, I think some mixture of those players. So for him to be in that elite camp means a lot for the Guerrillas at this moment. We all know they had that crazy, clutch when we talk about, the Berlin hardpoint where, Neptune was able to go off. That extends their series. It gets into a game 5. So there is some historical significance when we talk about this series, and most recently with LAG, it's been some tight matchups. But the one thing for LAG as well is that they're basically 500 in everything, right? They still have that spark. It feels like at different moments, and it feels like every time that they play a top team, they play up to their competition. As we said, they play up to Toronto, who are off of their 3rd place finish at Major 3. They play up to their competition. They beat Atlanta FaZe. They play up to their competition. They beat the London Royal Ravens. So it feels like with this LAG lineup that they really turn up when they absolutely have to. And the thing for the Guerrillas is that as of this moment, right, going into the tournament, they sit with 145 points. Minnesota and Florida sit at 140. So if either Minnesota or Florida win these games, because these 4 games will take place on day 1, these 4 games will take place on day 2. If either Minnesota or Florida win, LAG are instantly in the bottom 4, and they have to win a series to reclaim that spot and obviously pray that nobody overtakes them. So again, this is a big moment for LAG because this could be their last hurrah. This could be their last moment to possibly get some points on the board. This could be their last series of Vanguard. And I'm going to go for a wild call, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to go for a wild call, and I'm going to say that LAG takes it in a 3-1 fashion. There is nothing against London. This very well could be Toronto, who is in this spot. And honestly, just kind of came down to matchups. And honestly, I feel like when we look back at the series versus London, while it was a crazy game 5, I want to pull it up so I get the predictions accurate. Again, this is the most recent matchup that they had at the Major 4 qualifiers. London went up 2-0, but it was a 20-point hardpoint game on the Tuscan. It was a round 11 in the S&D, as we know for London are common. And then in the control, it was a 3-0 win by LAG. They looked much better in their controls. They're winning Berlin. They're winning Tuscans 3-1 versus New York and Atlanta. Then we get to the game 4. Again, they make that heroic hold where obviously London should have taken it, but LAG clutch up. And then when it came down to that final Tuscan S&D, LAG managed to take it 6-3. So it feels like LAG can beat up this team in S&D. And it also feels like this team can also beat them in control, as they did most recently, and maybe even contest or get dicey in the hard points. So I feel like this is the series to call for an upset. As I said, it very well could be Toronto in this spot, but if Toronto beat London, I think that LAG are happy to face off against this Ravens team, and I think they beat them in 4. I think that LAG beat them in 4. I think we're all shocked. We're all surprised. London, the number 1 seed, goes out top 12. Another unfortunate land placement. And who knows, when it comes into champs, the way they're going to play, again, it's hard because it's not as if I'm rooting for this to happen. It's just from an on-paper perspective, the way that I think the cards could fall ultimately in the end. So let's move forward. LIT versus Paris. I have Thieves off the loss versus Atlanta. I think that series could be very close, but both teams have matched up in the Major 4 qualifiers. Thieves were unfazed. A quick 3-0. The biggest positive for Thieves is that they are a very difficult matchup for Legion, especially because they like the big maps. And the problem for Paris is that they do like the big maps, but they really like Bocage. Thieves, that is their auto veto. And the thing as well is that Paris basically gives them Gavutu control every single time they play. So with the Bocage hardpoint instantly out, Paris gets their auto veto out. We end up playing Gavutu for hardpoint. We very well play Gavutu for control. Feels like 9 out of 10 times that's going to go LAT's way, especially versus Paris. And like I said, because of their recent W's versus this Legion lineup, I think that Thieves have the ability to absolutely take this series. I think from a matchup perspective, as I said, it's just difficult. And this could be the final series for Paris Legion this season. If they do lose this game, their season is over, and this is the end of the line for them in Vanguard, as they are not going to be able to make it to champs. Johnny, Jimbo, Temp, and Gravity, this could be their last series. This is their last chance to really be, those Reapers, as we talked about it. They got very close versus Minnesota, very close versus Florida, back-to-back Game 5 losses for them. So I feel like Paris are definitely playing better at this moment. But as we said, when it comes to matchups, I just don't think they match up well versus this Thieves team. But hey, if you're Paris, you got nothing to lose, right? You're just trying to play for... I'll say this. When I say there's nothing to lose, I mean from a results perspective. Like, we already know they're not going to champs, but there actually is a lot to play for, right? It is actually more to play for than a lot of other teams. They have their careers to fight for. So I feel like for Paris, the sense of urgency is there. And I think they can play Thieves closely. I just think at best this goes to a game 4 and Thieves take it. Maybe go... I don't know, maybe at worst go 3 for 3 in the respawns, but Thieves are looking better in S&D, and we could have a Gavutu hardpoint followed up by, I don't know, insert search destroy here that Thieves take, and then a Gavutu control, and it works out perfectly for Thieves. I think this very well could be 3-0, and I think, honestly, I just convinced myself. I'm going to say 3-0 for Thieves. They move forward, and it's the Battle of LA in elimination round 2. We jump down now to Minnesota versus OpTic Texas. We take a small break, and now we discuss this one, right? Minnesota off the loss versus New York. I have them losing to the Subliners in a 3-0 fashion. If not, New York falls in round 1, and this could be Crimsix versus OpTic, Crimsix versus Scump for New York for Crimsix season, right? That would be one of the more wilder series that we have had the entire year, and it could be one of the more historical matchups that we have in COD history if it ends up going down, and depending on what the result is. I don't want to get into it that much because we just haven't predicted it, but I did make a previous YouTube short. I highlighted a lot when New York played OpTic Texas in the Major 4 qualifiers, how important that series was, because all things considered, if New York didn't beat Seattle, for example, then that series would probably define whether or not the Subliners could even have a chance at getting the champs. Long story short, New York beat them at the Major 4 qualifiers. They also beat them at the Major 3 qualifiers, and the list went on. So, again, this could be New York, but I think more often than not, it's probably going to be Røkkr, who faces off against OpTic Texas, who shockingly are in the elimination bracket. They go 1-4 throughout the qualifiers. They go 1-2 more specifically with iLLeY. I mean, I'm not as in full panic mode as a lot of other people are, but a loss here would definitely put me in that position. It's just not looking good from OpTic all the way around. Like, the only thing that they are winning right now is search destroys. The hard points are not there. The controls do not look great as of late. They haven't won a single control recently with iLLeY. And it feels like practice for them is unbelievably important. We're talking about boot camping. I feel like they should be practicing more than anybody else, given the level, the talent that we know that they can be at. It's been a shaky last few matchups. And when you point at like one thing in particular, it's not as if like the easy thing would be to say, oh yeah, well, iLLeY's not playing well. And whenever he starts playing well, the team's going to start to succeed. It really isn't that way. Like, they are having a very hard time of getting back into the swing of things with all 4 players. And like I said, it's hard to identify when it's up at a practice perspective what to work on first, because like I said, the hard point's not great. The control is abysmal at the moment. S&D has been their best. And then when you look at recent results, Scump and Shotzzy did not look great versus Toronto in that reverse sweep. I mean, they got beat pretty badly by Bance and Kleenex. Versus NYSL, the ARs didn't play, or rather put up great numbers either. So there's questions around their composure. It feels like OpTic Texas, if they get punched in the mouth, they have a hard time recovering. It feels like when OpTic, go up 2-0 versus teams like Toronto, Ultra has a statement game and they just can't bring it back. We'll see if that can be a factor in this series versus Røkkr. But I think this is a huge series for both of these teams, because obviously it is panic mode instantly hit if you are OpTic, because if you lose this matchup versus Minnesota, you go out top 12. What does that say about this team going into champs? If Røkkr end up losing this series, they're done, right? I mean, there's no way that Minnesota can get into the top 8, because they'd already be down at least 5 points. They're already in the 9th seed. They're 5 points away from passing LAG. If Røkkr lose this matchup, their season is over. And the one thing for Røkkr as well, I mean, are they going to go out not winning another matchup on LAN? Like, is this going to be another major tournament where the talk of Røkkr just being an online team, being the Minnesota Routers, is that going to be a thing that stands? like I said, this is their last chance. And if they lose this, they're not going to champs. And I think that Minnesota end up taking it. I think that they survive. I think with the sense of urgency that Røkkr are going to have, their season is on the line. Now's the time to give it everything that you have just to try and move on forward, right? Just to try and overcome what would be a very unfortunate way to close out their season. I feel like given all the issues with OpTic right now, as we said, the SMG's not fully on point. The AR sometimes are not on point. The respawns are not looking great. I feel like for Røkkr, this is a great opportunity to face off against an OpTic team who is not themselves, at least as of this moment. They're not themselves online. I don't think that they can instantly change that when it comes to LAN. And versus a Minnesota team that can be streaky at times, that can be difficult to predict. And versus a team that, as we said, has their season on the line, possibly careers on the line. I think that Røkkr come out and they take this in just 4 matchup, or rather in 4 games, and they move forward. So we'd be talking, if Minnesota beats OpTic Texas and LAG loses to London, that puts Røkkr for a moment, that puts them into the top 8. And if everything ended this way, they make it into the top 8. LAG do not, Florida does not, New York does not. But as I said, based off my predictions, I have LAG beating London, meaning that these teams both get 10 points because of the 5-point advantage that LAG already has on them. That means that Minnesota's going to work that much harder and at least get 1 series further than LAG, because LAG's won a match, or won a major. They had that +5 added to their total at the end. So really, if you're Minnesota, you just have to outplace LAG by 1 series and try to get to elimination round 3 if they are not able to do so. Which we will find out who both these teams are going to face off against. We're going to stay in the losers bracket for a little bit. We'll now jump to Florida versus Seattle. And I'd preface this with, obviously, Florida are off the loss, right, versus Boston 3-1. I will preface this series with, while Seattle has not looked like themselves at all, they've looked like a shell of themselves most recently. It's always hard to predict against them. Like, it really is. It's hard to predict against the Seattle team. They are off of a 4-game losing spree, right? They lose versus Boston, they lose versus New York, they lose versus Minnesota, they lose versus Atlanta. Their only W has come versus the Paris Legion. And now they stack themselves up against a Florida team who, very similar to Minnesota in the last go around, it's for their season. Florida loses this and they are out. This is their final series of Vanguard. It's hard because there's not like a super logical way to be like, yeah, so this is the way that this series is going to go down, because Seattle, I know they've lost online, but they're going to play better on LAN. I think that when it comes down to the LAN environment, I feel like Seattle have had a wake-up call. I know that Mack is always typically better in the LAN environment. And when it comes down to Seattle versus Florida, I think from a map veto perspective, from a map matchup perspective, I do like Seattle more than I like Florida, because I think that Seattle, despite losing some bokages lately, can still be competitive on that. If you put Sib in a position where he has to go off, I think he plays well also. And I think really it just comes down to Mack. Like, I think that Mack has really been the only player who, to me, has held back Seattle from at least getting their 2nd win, if not their 3rd win. If you look at that matchup that Seattle has versus Minnesota, I mean, they are wild numbers that Sib and Pred both put up. I mean, it was like 1.3s, 1.2s, despite losing to the Røkkr. So I feel like Sib is without question one of the best SMGs in the league. Sib, while not unbelievably consistent, looks like one of the better ARs that we have in the game at times. It feels like Mack is that missing piece, and I feel like on LAN, he plays way better. I think he goes from like a 0.93 to like a 1.8, something like that. So he usually plays better in a LAN environment. And versus this Florida team, which they're playing against, an SMG duo that I'm just not a fan of right now with Florida. I'm really not. I'm not a fan of this, Too Real and Awakening combo. I think I take Mack and Pred in that every single day of the week. And I think that Seattle moves forward in this series and they take it, I don't want to say easily, but I think they do get through this series. Maybe it goes 5. I really don't think it does. I think maybe at best this goes to a game 4. Seattle handle business, and that's the end of the road for Florida. Just like that. They face off against Surge, a team that struggled lately, that's lost their last 4, but picks it up because, again, they're just a better LAN team in my opinion. And I just don't see a world in which Surge drop this series versus Florida. Again, from a map veto perspective, from a matchup perspective, I just think that Seattle is favored every single time. So Florida, their season ends here. I mean, I'd love to talk about this. I feel like we can make like an hour-long video about each one of these results. It's just you're not able to do it. So then we jump into LAG versus LAT. The Battle of LA very well could be, in my opinion, Thieves, I don't know, versus LAG. It could be versus London. It could be versus Toronto. There are a lot of teams that Thieves could be in a matchup against. I think a lot of people are going to have them losing to Atlanta, but beating Paris. So again, it feels like Thieves are basically a definite to be here. Who they face off against could be one of 3 different rosters. But as I said, I've got Guerrillas here. There's a very high likelihood that it could not be Guerrillas in this position. So given what I've got in front of me, if predictions are 100% accurate, right? If all of the calls that I've made so far throughout the bracket, if they are true, this is the way that things would look. LAT would be the number 7 seed at 160. LAG would be the number 8 seed at 155. If LAG loses, right, and Minnesota just wins 1 more series, they would miss out on champs. If New York wins 2 more series, LAG would miss out on champs. So if LAG, they give it their last hurrah. Let's say they beat London. They give it their best shot versus Thieves. They are praying that if they lose this matchup, that Minnesota does not win another one. They lose to Seattle, and that New York at least doesn't beat both Boston and both either Toronto or Atlanta or London, depending on who wins this game. So like I said, for LAG, you were just hoping you get through 1. If you get through 2, that could be the difference. I don't expect LAG to win the tournament by any means, make a super long run, but if they can win 1, if not 2 series, that, like I said, probably and very well could solidify their spot when it comes down to their top 8 hopes. So that's where things sit at the moment if our predictions are accurate. I'm just gonna say it outright. I just feel like from an on paper perspective, an LAT on land, they've got a matchup versus Paris. They've got a matchup versus LAG. I know I just have Guerrillas off of a W versus London, so I feel like Guerrillas are going to be playing better. But I think from a results perspective, I like Thieves more in the hard points. I think from an S&D perspective, I think that you give Thieves the edge there as well. Control, maybe you do also. So again, to me, it's a lot about matchups. Like you could say, well, London's obviously a better team versus Thieves. How does LAG beat London but lose to LAT? Again, it's hard to like spell out, like to get like an exact like whiteboard and break it down exactly with the way that my mind works and the way that I'm thinking about it. But I just feel like from a matchup perspective, Thieves probably take this, I would say, in a game 4, if not game 5. And LAG get eliminated from the tournament, but it's not guaranteed on if this will be their last match of the season, because as we said, they are 5 points ahead of Minnesota. Can Røkkr catch them, right? Can Minnesota just at least get through Seattle and put themselves into the top 8 for the moment? And at that point, as long as they stay alive, the higher percentage that they get into the top 8. Because as we said, Florida's out. Paris, obviously, are already out. LAG are out. It comes down to Minnesota, LAG holding on, and then New York trying to make the Cinderella run. So let's jump into this, right? Minnesota versus Seattle. Off the rip, a very difficult series to call, just in general because of what my current line of thinking is, which is that Minnesota fighting for their lives, desperation, giving it all that they've got. Seattle, I mean, what surge are we going to have at this moment? Because if they're beating Florida, typically Seattle isn't inconsistent in terms of like one match to the next. It's usually in quantities. Like it's usually Seattle does not play well for a few stretches, or they play very well for a few stretches. I think that if Seattle is beating Florida, I do like Seattle probably more than I like Minnesota. Again, if Surge are playing well, these teams matched up in the Major 4 qualifiers. Røkkr did beat them in a Game 5 round 10. And as I said, Pred and Sib were excellent in what looked like it was going to be the reverse sweep. Again, I will say this multiple times. Standy goes like -30 or -40 in that matchup. I think if Mack plays slightly better, if they close out a few situations, I think Seattle win that series the majority of the time. And that's on top of Seattle obviously not playing their best COD. So I think I'm expecting Seattle to play better, on top of the fact that they're going to be in this game. They played Minnesota most recently in the Major 4 qualifiers, and they barely lost. I think Seattle also not just beat Florida, but beat Minnesota, which would be one of the crazier lines if we're talking about results. What that means, Seattle could end the hopes of 2 of our 3 teams that are desperately trying to get into the top 8. Again, these would be massive W's if they're able to take it. I think that Seattle does, but I think it's a very close matchup. I think Røkkr bring it to a game 5. Surge beat them. And with that, LAG maintained their top 8 position. Røkkr fall 5 points short of having that, and I won't say guarantee, but having that spot at least for the time, and betting on themselves versus the Cinderella story for New York. I think it's going to be a crazy result. I think the elimination bracket's going to be wild. But again, I think that Seattle take it in a game 5. And unfortunately, Minnesota just barely miss out. Which again, I'd love to talk about that more in depth. It's just difficult because we only have so much time. So let us jump up to now the winners round 2 side of things. Toronto versus Atlanta. Again, I have Toronto off the win versus London. This very well could be London here in this position. And as we know, London did manage to take down Atlanta FaZe in our Major 4 qualifiers. However, based off my predictions, I had Toronto beating London. And if I'm going to talk about this series, it has been that Toronto has not beaten Atlanta so far this year. They've lost to them twice at Major 3. They lost to them in a 3-0 at the Major 4 qualifiers. And while I feel like Atlanta aren't at their ultimate best, and I have Toronto beating the Ravens, again, from a matchup perspective, I don't think that Ultra had that dramatic or that crazy situation where everything turns around and all of a sudden they're beating Atlanta FaZe. Like, I don't think that Toronto go from, losing 3-0 to Atlanta to automatically just being able to beat them. I like them versus London, but I think from a matchup, perspective, I think that Atlanta manages to take it versus the Toronto boys. And I'm going to say it's going to be in a 3-0 or 3-1. I will list it as a 3-1 because I think, again, Ultra are playing better COD at this moment. So let us jump into our next matchup that is also, by the way, another winners finals for Atlanta FaZe. Can they make it to the grand finals? We will see. New York versus Boston. Let me tell you, I am so excited to see this matchup on LAN if it happens, right? New York versus Boston, the legendary sports rivalry. Now in COD, we have, beefed up this matchup all season long. I've had the pleasure of casting these teams match up at least 2, if not 3 times throughout the season. Boston started off, I think it was at kickoff with the legendary, capsule streak versus NYSL. And now this could be, if New York loses, this could be their final matchup versus each other this year. If New York loses this is their season on the line. They are done. They are out and they're eliminated. Now, odds would probably have this matchup happening versus each other. But as I said, this to me would be the game to watch. One of the more exciting games of the season, especially if the New York crowd is going to be into it. I'm not 100% sure the New York crowd is going to be. I expect them to be solid, if not an amazing crowd. So I think this one is going to be electric. It's going to be phenomenal. And as I said, this is the first time. Toronto was incredible because the folks there haven't had a COD major either, and they were so grateful, so into it. I think the same thing could happen for New York as well. I think that New York, with the passion that they have, with the pride that New Yorkians have, I think that this series is going to be phenomenal. Now, New York, right? They get the win over Røkkr. At this point, and if my predictions are true, it doesn't get much better for New York coming into what would be a Saturday match. I apologize. I read that in the wrong tone. I wrote this in a little while ago. New York, it doesn't get much better for them than this because, let me go and change it up a little bit, because the 3 teams who are above them have just been eliminated, right? Florida, they fall to Seattle in round 1. Minnesota fall to Seattle in round 2, and LAG just dropped to the Thieves in elimination round 2. So while Minnesota do get a W, LAG get a W, that means that you have to catch them. At the very least, all of them are out. Florida is out, LAG is out, Minnesota is out, and now your destiny is up to you. It's up to you to make the run. There's no worry of any teams getting any more points. You know the number and you know what it has to be, which is very, very interesting. On top of that, getting more in depth with numbers, New York at this moment in time would be at 130 points. Florida would be at 140. Minnesota at 150. And if LAG, if they win their round 1 game, they're at 155. But again, a lot of people are not going to expect LAG to win a series in the elimination side. So it very well could be 150. That is the number that New York has to hit. So, like I said, Florida at 140, Minnesota 150, LAG either 145 or 155. So if New York, right, managed to hit 150, and let's put it this way. Let's say LAG does not win this, right? Let's say the LAG gets beaten by London or Toronto. So the magic number, as long as Minnesota ends up beating OpTic Texas, the magic number is 150. If it's not, right, if it's not, then it's 145 because that is what LAG has. So if LAG loses this game, Minnesota loses this game, and Florida loses this game, we jump from either, we're basically in the mode of 140 to 155 is essentially where New York, I think, will be at this point in the tournament. 140 on the low side, without a doubt, 155 on the highest of high side. So let's say, right, that if New York managed to hit 150 and Minnesota is the one team who does manage to win a series. So Florida loses both of theirs, LAG loses their one. Minnesota, though, manages to at least beat one team, that being OpTic. The number stays at 150. The interesting thing, right, is that New York doesn't have to reach 160. New York just has to match Minnesota. Why is that? Because New York then would hold the head-to-head match win percentage, which is the way that you define tiebreakers. What does that mean exactly? Basically, who has won more series versus each other? New York is 1-0 versus them in the regular season. If New York beats them twice, there is no question about it. New York would hold the tiebreaker versus Røkkr. So as I said, if Røkkr hit 150, LAG does not, Florida does not. If New York at least just matches them, they hold the tiebreaker and that is it, and New York is automatically in. But as I said, at this moment, they would be at 130. A W versus Boston will put them at 140. So one more series. If they beat Boston, it is just one more series and New York is home free. That is where things sit. Again, very difficult to explain, very complicated, but I hope that you rode with me throughout that. But as I said, if Minnesota continues to win, more than one series, if LAG stays alive, if Florida stays alive, it starts to fluctuate from there. But again, I think the most likely scenario is going to be Minnesota gets to 150, maybe 160. And as long as you're New York, all you have to do is tie Minnesota in points if they are the lead team, and you've got the head-to-head win percentage versus them, which is crazy to think about. Something that nobody's really talking about right now is that if Minnesota makes a run, New York, all they got to do is just be right there with them, and they're home free. Now, let's talk about this one, right? New York versus Boston more specifically. I think that just in general, the fans are going to be nuts for this. I think that New York, if they win the opening hardpoint, I like them more in the S&D. And I feel like from a matchup perspective, if you are Boston, again, you're a team that's reliant upon the hardpoints. I think that New York are a better hardpoint team than Boston. Vetoes are going to be important, but first hardpoint goes the way of New York. Big thing for New York is a matter of just closing out the search destroys. Boston have not been great in those as of late. That could be 2-0 for New York. Let's say that Boston wins the control, and then we're talking about another hardpoint. Maybe New York, this is a position for them to win another one, maybe in 3, if not 4. So I think that New York ends up taking this in a 3-1 fashion. I think they end up taking down the Boston breach and keep the Cinderella story alive. As we said, they win this game. That puts them even closer. They're still in their current seed for the moment. They have not eclipsed the top 4, or the top 8, still in the bottom 4, but they are one series away from getting into the top 8 as long as Minnesota does not advance, LAG does not advance, and Florida does not advance. So let us move on, right? Let us move on. But like I said, I have LAG at 155, so actually it wouldn't be... You get what I'm talking about. We'll move on. We're not making it any more complicated than it has to be. We'll move on. Boston versus LA Thieves. LAT have had their number, back-to-back 3-0 Ws. LAT on the season is 3-0 versus them. Thieves at this point would basically be locked in the top 8, with the only worry being of New York passing them. So the lowest that they could go would be to the 8th position. So again, not as much pressure by any means onto the Thieves or onto Boston because they are good. As we said, if the predictions are true, all of these things, they're solid, right? The only thing that they could do is drop to the 8th at the very lowest if you're LAT. Now, in the last 2 series that these teams have had, as I said, 3-0s, back-to-back 3-0 losses for Boston. Gavutsu has been 3 out of the 4 respawns, with a Berlin control being the other. The problem from a matchup perspective is almost a similar thing to Paris, right? Because Boston loves themselves some Bocage. That is something that Thieves instantly eradicate. They instantly get rid of that. And then Boston have to decide whether they want to play LAT on Tuscan or allow for the Gavutu to get through, because Boston is not playing Tuscan right now, which is arguably their biggest struggle when we talk about their map pool. And Boston does not have the Bocage, which most teams are cool to play them on Bocage, at least as of late. Now that they've discovered they're actually elite on it, it started to change up a little bit. But Boston will not play Tuscan. So you have a big decision to make if you're Breach. If you are in this position versus LAT, do you want to play them on that Gavutu and give it a go? Or do you decide to play on Tuscan? From a map perspective, from a results perspective throughout the season, you'd be saying, oh, you definitely don't play LAT on Tuscan. It's your auto veto, plus they're very good at it from a record perspective. The big thing, as we've been talking about consistently for Thieves, is their hardpoint map pool is not amazing, right? Because they are winning Gavutus and Berlin. If if Boston does end up banning out the Tuscan, then they are playing LAT on their only two hardpoint maps that they are winning consistently, that being Gavutu and that being Berlin. Again, sometimes you want to play your own game. At the same time, it is difficult if you're Breach, because I don't know if you really want to play the Thieves, who are on a 2-game winning spree, who are off of a little bit of momentum. You're off of a loss, right, versus New York. I'm not sure if you want to play this team on their two best hardpoints. I think that you almost sacrifice, depending on how your strength feels in Tuscan. I think that to me is going to be the ultimate decision maker of this series, is whether or not Boston decides to play Tuscan or ban out the Gavutu. That is something that is without a doubt something that you have to look out for. LAT, like I said, they've been playing Gavutu a lot versus Breach, and Breach have gotten 3-0'd the last two times that they played. Prior to that, LAT 3-1 them. So overall, not great for Boston. Now, when you look at the numbers, I mean, it's clear, right? As we said, on the AR maps, the ARs are frying. Octane at a 1.27 versus Boston this season. Kenny is at a 1.17 versus Boston this season. Everybody other than Methodz is below a 1. Again, just indicative of the fact that we are playing an AR team on AR maps. Nero sits at a 0.75 KD versus the Thieves this season. That's obviously going to have to change dramatically if Breach wants to stay alive in this tournament. Now, let's say this. LAT, how do I want to say this exactly? I think that LAT take Boston down again if the Tuscan decides to not be played. I think it could be huge for Breach long term if they decide to make that decision. LAT on land, playing Gavutu, possibly playing Gavutu control, limits Boston's biggest strength. And if the Thieves, who look better in S&D, are taking that versus Boston as well, it's just another one of those matchup perspectives where I feel like LAT are in a great position when it comes down to the map pool. Like outside of their hard points, which are limited, the one positive is that they're not playing Bocage, which it feels like a lot of the teams that they're going to be facing off against in this tournament like themselves some Bocage. And these teams are also not always banning out Gavutu. So if that's happening, you're taking away that team's biggest strength and you are getting your biggest strength on the other side. So I think from that perspective, I give Thieves the W. Boston do get eliminated in back-to-back matchups. They beat Florida, but they lose to New York and they lose to Thieves. Not a bad way to go out, but I'm sure not as happy as the Breach would like. And LAT now makes it into the elimination round 4 side of things, and they await to see who will face off against them, whether it is Toronto or whether it is Seattle. I will get into this quickly because we got to move forward. Both teams are safe in the top 8. Both have played better than they did in Major 4 qualifiers up to this point. Toronto had beaten them on the season in a 2-1 series count. It has come down to a game 5 twice. So 2 out of the 3 series that they've played this year, it has come down to a game 5. Honestly, just 2 of the more interesting teams that we have right now in the league. And I think I'm going to remain with this same mantra that Seattle are going to play better. As I said, Seattle, this is the London losing early and Seattle playing well are without a doubt my 2 biggest risks in my bracket. And I think it's only fair that I just roll with it. I think that Seattle ends up taking down Toronto. I think it comes down to another crazy game 5. And we continue the same talking point on, okay, Seattle, it feels like in the Major 4 qualifiers, their struggle was clutching things out. At Major 3, what was their biggest strong suit? It was clutching things out. I think they managed to do so, and that now marks 3 games in a row for LAT in the elimination side, 3 games in a row for Seattle. On the other side of the elimination bracket, these 2 teams meet up for a chance of getting into the elimination finals. So I guess we can go ahead and talk about that one next, which, as I said, Thieves versus Surge. Seattle are 2-0 versus them this season. There's no real avenue of attack, right, if you are the Thieves, because Seattle are a great team in control. They're going to get rid of both of the Gavutus, which to me is the reason why Seattle had that 2-0 mantra over them. The reason why they have that advantage versus them this season is because Seattle are basically allergic to playing either of the Gavutu respawns, which, as we said, is a primary focal point. If you're the Thieves, you want to play Gavutu as often as possible. Put your 3 ARs on 3 AR type of maps. Seattle's also a really good team in control. LAT at this moment sit at 4-1 coming into the tournament. Their results are going to be all over the place, obviously, once the game starts to get played. But we'll have probably a Tuscan and a Berlin in this series. And at that point, to me, it just comes down to the talent on both the teams. You know, throughout this year and the two matches that they've had, Sib is at a 1.31 versus the Thieves. Mack is at a 1.24. Funny enough, Pred actually has the lowest KD versus the Thieves, which is really interesting to think about. He's also like at a 1.04. So that just kind of goes to show Surge have not just been beating the Thieves, but they've been beating them handily off of Sib and Mack just having excellent performances. LAT all around are around a 0.8 versus Seattle. More specifically, Kenny is at a 0.64. And as we said, that's because they're one of those teams that is making Thieves pull out the SMG as often as possible. I think when it comes down to a matchup-wise perspective, I think that this is a best case scenario type of moment if you're Seattle. I think you want to see a Thieves in this spot, a team that has gotten those Gavutus, a team that's gotten those Berlins more consistently than not. And then you're going to come into this series and say, oh, cool, we're going to get rid of the Gavutus. And then, as we said, they just have that star power. They have those 3 young, talented players, Sib, Pred, and Mack, who I think are going to be playing great. And as we said, versus the Thieves on the season, Sib and Mack have been excellent. And I think they take down the LA Thieves in a 3-1 fashion. I think gets to a game 4, but that is it. Surge somehow, some way, despite a horrible performance in the Major 4 qualifiers, managed to turn things around and get into the top 3. Who will they face off against for a chance at the finals? It's time to talk about it. Atlanta versus New York. A win guarantees top 2. A win in this moment guarantees New York a spot at champs because they'd hit that 150 mark, tie with the Røkkr, and have the head-to-head. If LAG, though, does get that 1 series W, it makes things a little bit more difficult. New York would then have to not just beat Atlanta, but win in the finals as well. So a lot of things to think about if you are the New York Subliners. So currently at the 150 mark, how does it go, right? How does it go? Atlanta FaZe are off of, a solid few Ws. They beat the Thieves. They beat Toronto. Now they're in the spot that they are. Why can I not slide? Where is this at? There we go. Why is it like this? Okay. So how does this one go? Like I said, I think New York has played Atlanta 3 times this season. They lost all of those matches. I want to focus in on the match from the Major 3 qualifiers that they have versus one another. Because as I said, it's been difficult series for the Subliners so far throughout this year. But that matchup at the Major 3 qualifiers was very, very interesting. As we said, the exact same teams. Nobody has changed. There's been no role changes, anything of that nature. New York in that series versus Atlanta goes 1-0 up after winning a Berlin hardpoint. New York then went up 4-1 on a game 2 Bocage search and destroy off of some wild clutches, off of some great plays from Hydra. But despite going up 4-1 versus Atlanta, New York allowed for FaZe to come back on that S&D and ultimately win it in a round 11. FaZe would gain that momentum, win the control, win the hard point. Why did I talk to you about that series? The reason is because if New York is winning search and destroys, they're going to be one of the most difficult teams in this tournament to beat because of how solid their hard points are. If they're able to win S&Ds, not only does it give them that 1-2 punch to go up 2-0, but it gives them that buffer to lose a hard point and almost guarantee they're at least going to win 1 hard point in a set. That gives them at least 2 maps, and then you go on from there. The reason why I talk about that series is because New York had that 2-0 start versus Atlanta in the bag. And we'd be talking about, hey, a most recent matchup between Atlanta FaZe and New York. Oh, yeah, New York was able to take it. Or at least it goes to a game 5. We talk about it as if, it's just a 3-1 win for Atlanta. When you really look at the details, if NYSL were closing out S&Ds versus Atlanta FaZe, they would be in a much better position, right? They would have probably won that series. If not, like I said, won it maybe in a game 4, maybe it goes to a game 5, etc., etc. Now, as I said, S&D is going to be the name of the game. I think at this point, Subliners are going to be aware of what they have to do. They win this, they're most likely in, contingent on if LAG do what they have to do. New York are going to be aware that if they win this matchup, they're good, right? They're in such a wonderful spot. When it comes down to it, they're going to be into the top 8. I think with that sense of urgency, with the crowd behind them, with, just all the eyes on New York, I think that New York end up taking down Atlanta FaZe in a 3-2. I think that New York managed to beat Atlanta. It goes to a game 5. They managed to take the series. And from that point, FaZe is not guaranteed a grand final spot. And now we're down here. Atlanta versus Seattle. One of the more historical matchups. As I said, one of the best matchups that we've had in CDL history, in COD history, between these two. And on LAN, it's been legendary, right? Most recently, it was not good, right? Atlanta totally smoked Seattle when it came down to the Major 4 qualifiers. It was their most recent W that Atlanta FaZe get. But Seattle Surge on LAN, it has been differently a majority of the time. And Seattle, this is a matchup from Major 3. They played each other twice. Seattle beat them in the winners finals off of 2 of the crazier clutches that we've seen in COD history. One of the best series ever of all time, right? The 4v16, 5v6, whatever it was, come back in the control, followed up by a 90 to 100 point comeback and the hard point, and then to just ultimately beat them when it came down to the finals to give Seattle the championship. Can they do it here? Right? Is it going to happen this time around? Can Seattle do it again versus Atlanta FaZe, even though they just got smoked by them online? Seattle in the midst of making one of the more impressive losers bracket runs that we've seen in a very, very long time, as they've beaten Florida, they've beaten Minnesota, they've beaten Toronto, they've beaten Thieves. Are they going to beat Atlanta again? I think it goes to a game 5. And I think Atlanta takes it. I do. I think Atlanta FaZe puts this storyline to bed, and despite losing to New York in a game 5, they are eager coming into this matchup versus New York and looking for their very first championship of the season. Their first major championship, despite it being their 4th straight major final in a row. The spotlight's going to be onto them. The spotlight also is going to be onto New York, as top 8 would be guaranteed at this point. They've made it to the final. Can they close out the W, right? Can they close out the W versus their home crowd? The icing on the cake, and really just the best of positions going into champs. It would be crazy if it's actually happening. Now, one thing that I want to talk about, because it's so difficult to be like, oh yeah, so New York versus Atlanta, they're off a series versus each other. How's it going to go, right? They're going to win the hard point. It's probably going to be on this map, whatever. We're going to have so many games. We're going to have 15, 16 series between what I'm talking about right now and this series. So it's basically impossible to point out, what exactly the details are going to be. But the one thing that I will mention is this. How have teams managed to beat Atlanta FaZe previously in these finals, right? How have Atlanta dropped their last 3 major finals versus OpTic, versus LAG, versus Seattle? The biggest point that I have to talk about is the fact that all 3 of those teams versus Atlanta were able to get early momentum. In every single one of these final sets, OpTic, LAG, Seattle, all of them either went up 3-1 or 3-0. So that early momentum is such an important factor, and I think especially for a team like Atlanta FaZe, who went into that matchup versus OpTic Texas, they get silenced early because of the crowd. They go into the next, major after losing to OpTic versus LAG. They're shocked, right? We're losing to the Guerrillas. We're losing to this team, right? They come out, they start off up 3-1 versus you. You go into the series versus Seattle thinking, hey, we threw that one away. Are we really going to lose 3 majors in a row in the finals, finish top 2, beat the Silver Surfers of the CDL? it gets in their head. And I think whoever this is, right? If anybody, if FaZe gets to the grand finals, this is going to be the same story for everybody. The early momentum is so important versus the Atlanta FaZe, not just because you want to, just get out of the gates hot, prove that you can beat Atlanta, but you want to show that Atlanta doesn't have what it takes to win a final, right? You want to show that you've already beaten them 3-0 or 3-1 if you start off like every other team has. And I think from a mentality perspective, after just 3, if not 4 series or 4 maps, all 3 of these teams recognized and realized, hey, we just beat this team in what would be a normal series. We can definitely take them out in the rest of it. So as I said, early momentum is number 1. That is the way that teams have been able to beat Atlanta FaZe. Go up 3-0, go up 3-1. The next thing, and arguably the most important for all 3 of these rosters, and it would be for New York, is game 5 through game 7. S&D, control, S&D. This is where typically Atlanta eyes up trying to make the comeback. And if you do not get ahead of them early, this to me is where they can start to really make a run, take the advantage, maybe close you out potentially if you don't get off to a great start. Because as we said, control, S&D, this is where the pace starts to slow down. Atlanta, this is why they've been working so heavily on their search to destroy, is for this very moment. It is for best of 9s. It is for champs. An S&D, a control, and a search destroy. You've got to be solid here. And if you don't get off to a good start, this is where you have to bring it back, and what is probably going to be the more difficult portion of this set. But as we said, you get off to a good beginning, you got to take at least one of the game 5, game 6, or game 7s to put you up, whether that's 3-2, whether that be 4-1, whatever it may be, right? 4-2, et cetera. You got to play well off the start and hope that by this point you're in the advantage, if not playing well at this point. Because as I said, this is where Atlanta's going to bring it back. It's going to be in the S&Ds, and it's going to be in the controls, especially versus a New York team. Number 3, limit one of the tiny tears. That has been how Atlanta's got 0 for 3 in their majors, because the tiny tears, Simp and aBeZy, one of them has not showed up the way that they typically do. Simp goes -24 versus OpTic Texas. aBeZy goes -32 versus LAG. aBeZy goes -33 versus Seattle. So again, early momentum. Shut down the tiny tears. You got to start off 3-0. Take advantage of those hard points if you are in YSL. Get through the grueler game 5 through game 7. Get through those 3 maps of the set. Try to be up. Limit the tiny tears. And number 4, you got to have a dynamic duo, right? You got to have that crazy 1-2 punch. For OpTic Texas, it was Scump and iLLeY. Obviously, Shotzzy had his moments. Dashy had his moments. But ultimately, it was the 1-2 punch of Scump and iLLeY leading the way a majority of the time. For LAG, undoubtedly, it was Slasher and Hook, right? You had clutches being made from everybody on the team, but ultimately it was Slasher and Hook that it came down to. And for Seattle, it was undoubtedly Sib and Pred. Those 2 guys went off versus the Atlanta FaZe. They limited aBeZy. Obviously, as we said, for OpTic, they limited Simp. LAG, they limited aBeZy. And they did the same thing that New York are going to have to do. Now, yes or no question for myself. Is New York going to be able to do this? Are they going to be able to complete that 4-step process? I think they do. I think that they do it. If I have New York versus Atlanta in the bracket filling out the way that it is, I think that New York have what it takes to beat Atlanta FaZe. Not just in the winners final, but in the grand final as well. Because as I said, I'm just going to say this one last time before we close out the video and before we talk about what the final standings would look like going into champs. There is something going on with Atlanta where they desperately need to win one of these majors. Honestly, I would rather, from a mentality perspective, Atlanta FaZe get eliminated top 3 than lose another major final, because the mental block that would provide you with would be huge going into champs, thinking that, hey, we have lost versus 4 different teams, 4 different majors, where we were the best team last season. We can't afford to have that happen again. Surely not. So if it happened for a 4th time, to me, that would hurt Atlanta FaZe more than anything going into champs. Like I said, I would rather them finish top 4, top 3 rather than lose in the finals. However, it is hard to not put Atlanta FaZe getting to the finals. It's difficult to not think that, yeah, they're going to beat, Atlanta, or rather LAT first round. I have them facing off against Toronto. I feel like they definitely stand a great chance versus Toronto rather versus London. And then you have them facing off against what? Maybe New York or Boston. I don't think we see Minnesota or Florida, get to this point. So again, I mean, the top side of the bracket lists out the way that it does. And I think it favors Atlanta FaZe to face off against New York. If New York takes them down for the reasons that I listed, we go into a grand final where FaZe maybe gets here. Maybe it's LAT versus, Atlanta, where they match up again. I still like Atlanta FaZe in that game. It's just difficult. But as I said, those are the steps that it takes. And I think that Atlanta FaZe manages to take this series 5-3. They're going to rely heavily on the hard points. The search destroys are going to be big just to increase that cushion. I think the control is going to have to be there as well. And I'd probably say the MVP of the tournament is going to have to be Hydra. Hydra's going to have to be the MVP of this tournament. If not, maybe Paul as well. I mean, I feel like you could list off all 4 players, but I think for me, the 1-2 punch, right, where we're talking about things for NYSL, if it's going to be anybody, it's got to be, some form of of Kiz and Kismet of Kismet and Krim at different times. Probably it's been a long video of Kismet and Krim at different times, but largely it's going to be Paul and Hydra. Game 5 through game 7 is going to be the test. If New York get off to a great start, that is what can seal the deal for them. New York win 5-3. They get crowned champions of their own major, pull off the Cinderella story, somehow managed to get to the top 8 after what looked like an improbable, an unbelievable possible run. The fact that they were able to get it would be incredible. Krim gets another win. Hydra, Paul, and Kismet get a W. And New York are looked upon as one of the best teams, if not the best team, moving into champs, despite being in the 11th seed coming into the tournament. Crazy stuff. Crazy stuff. That is the way that I've got it. That is the way that I've got it. I'm submitting my predictions. I'm confirming them. And that is the way that this is going to roll. As we said, some wild ones. Obviously, having New York win it is not going to be a favorite prediction. Seattle making one of the crazier losers bracket runs is something that I'm sure a lot of people are not going to have. London going out as early as they did is something that a lot of people are not going to have. Maybe OpTic losing early, LAG, getting to round 2, Minnesota getting to round 2. A lot of things that could obviously change the bracket up. However, I do want to point out, this would be what the final standings are looking like. So, who made it to the top 8? As we said, New York manages to get that spot. Does any other shifts happen? They do not. However, we do see a few shifts overall in the seeds and who ends up making it where. So, if my predictions are accurate, we go 100%, if not very close to it. Atlanta ends up getting the first seed at 330. OpTic get the second seed at 235 points. Seattle just under them because of the run that they make. They get to 225 points, just 10 points behind OpTic in the third seed. London, no points awarded to them. They get 190, tied for Boston. I haven't really looked at the standings for that one in terms of matchups head to head, but still, you get the point. London and Boston both at 190. Toronto and LAT, they're tied at 180. And because of New York's plus 65 that they get from winning this major, they go from 110 to 175, and they slide into the 8th seed. Again, if Toronto loses early, if LAT loses a tad earlier as well, you could see New York get as high as maybe, they could possibly get the 6th seed if maybe things start to go their way a little bit. If LAG loses early, and maybe if Minnesota, Florida get out earlier than expected, maybe it doesn't take 175. Maybe it takes, as I said, 150, 160. The numbers are obviously up there, but I do have a lot of confidence in this New York team. I'm obviously not just going to say that New York's going to win it because of the story. I think that's obviously involved in it, but I really do think that Subliners are playing great COD right now. They really are. They're playing excellent Call of Duty. They lose that series versus Thieves, which is never going to be easy, but still, it feels like the writing's on the wall. They're dominant in hardpoint. They just have to be better in the search destroys. And I think the controls are going to only come along as well. It feels like when we talk about the way that this team likes to play, every life is important. They're not playing for kills, right? They're a team who is playing ultimately with the most impact. Like it feels like every life that New York has is valuable in some sense of the word. Not trying to go for the KDs or whatever it may be. Every life is valuable and every life is doing something on the map. So I think that New York, for that reason, takes it. Again, crazy results, crazy stuff. Let me know down in the comments. If you guys have made it this far, I greatly appreciate it. This is our longest LandO's lock-ins of all time, but it's because of what's on the line, right? It's because of the top 8, it's because of the bottom 4, it's because of all the storylines, all the situations, etc. It's gonna be madness. I mean, it is. It is going to be absolute madness, absolute chaos when it comes to the bracket. As I said, let me know down in the comments what your guys' brackets are looking like. Let me know. Even critique mine. You know, if you saw one thing where you're like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think London probably makes it a little farther. I don't think Seattle makes that run. I think that OpTic definitely improves. LAT doesn't make it far. You know, New York, they don't make it in the top 8, or whatever it may be. Let me know down in the comments what your guys' thoughts are. Again, I greatly appreciate all the support that you guys have been showing on this series. We have got one more episode left, which is going to be at Champs. I cannot wait to see it. We'll be having some content come out probably between Major 4 ending and Champs starting, so be on the lookout for that. But again, greatly appreciate you guys for tuning in to this episode. You guys take it easy, have a wonderful night, and I will see you guys on the broadcast for the New York Major. Take it easy. See you later.